El Vilvoy de las Islas. Ah, las Islas Encantadas. Ah, in fact, the visions which the name itself enconjures. How many other archipelagos, some of them quite non-existent, have borne that enchanted name before it was finally settled on the group of islands in the South Atlantic? Settled at least by some, that is. Perhaps these wild, wild islands had indeed not ever been visited by da Gama, Vespucci, the brothers Pignon, Sebastian Cabot, Ponce de Leon, Cartier, Drake, Sir John Hawkins, and many another. And then, after all, perhaps they had. As Lope de Vega, Cervantes, Calderon puts it in his dry, spare style, ¿Quién sabe? Not I. My friend Diego had driven up with the Land Rover of his choice, a safari wagon with space for 12 passengers and the driver. Much good it would be without one. Or, say, 2 people, and lots of baggage, a point which he made almost at once. Oh, I don't doubt it, I said, admiring the spare tire and fancying myself, almost, in Kenya with Papa. How would you like to drive down to the Straits of Magellan? Sorry, I just washed my beard and I can't do a thing with it. No, I'm not joking. How would you like to... Diego, please. And that was how I came to be driving down to the Straits of Magellan. Can one drive up to it, them? Well, certainly. If you start in Tierra del Fuego, well, nothing to it, I suppose. Diego told me many stories of his boyhood, his family, his young manhood, his family, his country, and his family. After we crossed the equator, I had crossed it twice by sea and was able to contain my enthusiasm this third time, the stories grew fewer and his sighs more frequent. I do not wish to, indeed I can't, dismiss the entire South American continent cavalierly or, for that matter, in any other way. But this is not that story. As we went further and further south, of course it grew colder and colder. As for the land along the Straits of Magellan, I realized that they had never been fully developed as summer resorts. They were, I understood, cold, very cold, and very, very wet. After rising from sleep and sleeping bag one morning, almost in slow motion, I faced not only the foothills of the Andes, I was looking westward, but the fact that I was not only no longer young, I was not even middle-aged anymore. Diego, I said, my osteopath told me there would be days like this. Plain old degenerative osteoarthritis done got me. Leave me here to sink my bones into some hot bath and catch me when you come back. Although Diego gave me much sympathy, I felt that he was in some way rather relieved. Often and vividly, as he had described to me his family, it was by now certain that he faced returning to them with something less than the wilder zeals. Folklore has prepared us for the Latin Americans with very many stereotypes, so that when they pick up their guitars and burst into "Allá en Rancho Grande," and sometimes they really do, we feel that this is all as it should be, and we are prepared for that. But folklore has not prepared us in North America with any stereotypes at all, really, for Latin Americans of the deep south of South American latitudes. Reunited with his family after many years in the United States, how would Diego react? How would his family react? And how would I react? Perhaps these considerations also engaged Diego's mind, for although he assured me that hot baths were available in his family home, his tone lacked something of its once enthusiasm. "At any rate," he said at last, "I cannot simply leave you." His arms swept the chill, sparse landscape. "Here?" "Well, in the next town or city, then." No, mucha bronca, gente. Ah! His face lit up. "I shall leave you with people I know in Uruguay. It is not far. No, not even as far as the distance between New York and Milwaukee. I know some people there very well. No nonsense. They are very nice people. They will be very glad to have you. All this, I thought to myself, was as it may be, but it was no time nor place for an argument. Once there in that country, about which I knew next to nothing, surely I could find what we used to call reasonable accommodations. Diego might assure me till his breath stopped smoking, but face to face with the realities of the situation, he would accept my decision. God, he'd better. The rest of the trip, that is, of my trip to Uruguay, was rather painful bodily, but the spirit, or the journey, seemed to have lightened with our common realization that, after all, Diego would not have to explain his family to me, and me to his family. That all the reproachful scenes beginning, far be it from me to reproach you, but could do without the intrusive presence of an outsider and a foreigner, de populo barbaro, as it were. Populo, popolo, Descriptions of the fertile vineyards, the empires of wheat, the plantations of yerba mate, herds of kine and swine, these I must leave to others. Lo, are they not already waiting in the wings? The weather grew warmer, though never hot. The suburb where my friends' friends lived was old and, I have imagined, Roman suburb-like, with many a well-tended vegetation, lots of well-kept walls, and even the plant which I chiefly recognized, roses. Roses. The Senores Murphy were at home. What? Yes, Murphy. It would be indeed charming to write they still, after 3 or who knows, maybe more generations, still spoke English with a lovely brogue. Not so. No brogue at all? No brogue at all. He had brought me to Murphy's with no brogue at all. Of course, yes, they did speak English. Only English did they speak as soon as it was realized that this was my language. It was a rather flattened-out English. You would never in a million years have guessed, had you met them in, say, Switzerland, what part of the world they were from. And they expressed no surprise at all on learning that Diego proposed to deposit me with them. Evidently this really was the way things were done down there. Diego lingered 3 days, so it was scarcely that he was dropping me abruptly, and as we waved him off, laden with gifts for his parents, I seemed to be part of the family which belonged in that villa, in that never before heard of by me suburb of Ciudad Uruguay, of which, in fact, I had hardly heard of itself until then. A papal person had not long before said publicly that he was there to represent church interests in Paraguay, Uruguay, and every other kind of guay, i.e. woe. It was curious how very suddenly the Vatican had need of him at home, after all. I make no claim that I saw the real Uruguay. Indeed, even the unreal Uruguay I scarcely saw outside the very far-stretching walls of the villa, where, twice a day, a hot bath was drawn for me, and where I received every conceivable creature comfort and every conceivable courtesy. In very little time, the youngest children climbed into my lap, and even the next to youngest also came over and gave me a good morning and a good night kiss. Beside my ample bed, a matrimonial, in the grand old style, upon the nightstand were laid such items as an English-language newspaper, rather thin, as though the fat had been stripped off it, an elderly novel by Michael Arlen, but one which I had never read, and a fairly recent copy of the Illustrated London News. But if I were to go into detail, we should never get anywhere. So let us gel to a sort of small garden party. No, not a party. An informal gathering. Well, it was in the garden. It was only a few days that I had been a guest. I was sure that I had yet to meet every single member of the extended Murphy family, let alone very many members of the English-speaking population of Ciudad Uruguay. There was Senora Angela de something, whose husband was someone in the civil service, un burocrata, as it was, I thought, succinctly put. A Doctora Maria del Pilar Guzman, I'm not certain of the area of her doctorate, gastroenterology, perhaps early colonial rent rolls, perhaps. You can't tell anymore, men or women. However, I am aware of opening myself to all sorts of attacks, but nevertheless, I shall make this statement. I seldom saw a woman of the upper middle or upper classes there who did not have lines of discontent around the mouth. And I seldom saw a woman of the working class there who was not happy and smiling and laughing. Spit on me, stone me, that's the way I saw it. There was an older man, all in black and white, who at first glimpse I thought was a priest, but upon further attention was revealed to be an attorney, and there was a younger man, light-haired, in open shirt and khakis, whom I did not assess. He turned out to be a priest. Presently there entered a young man who was not introduced. He had rather longish and very brown hair, a farmer, or perhaps a hunter, by the look of him, and I don't recall that he said 3 words all the time he was there. And also, someone was there, a Doña Alberta, certain to be recognized everywhere as a universal grandmother. She was a moderately well-known British novelist on a visit from her home in the Isle of Wight. There were 1 or 2 others. I do not remember. Someone had politely asked Doña Alberta something, and she said, I am always interested in hearing of the legends and folklore wherever I am. Vent du pays, one might say. Won't someone please tell me something of that? She was a courageous woman. Very often one is told fairly crisply that there are no legends, no folklore, all such things have passed quite away. But now, almost at once, Licenciado Hubner said, Ah, of course. We have the tragical tale of La Llorona. And he proceeded to tell us, in great detail, and with much local color, the story of the Weeping Woman, which is found wherever Spanish is spoken and misspoken throughout the world. Right at this moment in your city, someone is telling it now and naming the very neighborhood through which you have unwittingly passed, where the unfortunate events occurred. I purposely do not tell it here. Let it come, perhaps, as a surprise. Someone said, Muy trágico. Heads were nodded, and then someone else said, Well, we have also the legend of El Vilvoy de las Islas. The novelist asked, Did you say Vilvoy or Vilvoy? Our host spelled it for her, and for me too. V-I-L V-O-Y, and added, We pronounce it, but I did not hear then how they pronounced it, because before the attorney had more than begun, the young priest, not meaning, I'm sure, to be impolite, merely, he was a bit emphatic, said, El Vilvoy? But that is surely a collection of nonsense. The attorney said very calmly, and as one certain of his facts, Sometimes we provincials, with all our naif enthusiasm, nevertheless arrive at a conclusion more veridical than the sophisticates of the metropolis. Oh, but surely I did not say provincials, and if by the metropolis you mean Spain or Madrid in particular, certainly I am a Madrileno, but... A servant approached with a tray. El Vilvoy, repeated Mrs. Flux, her real name, the novelist. But what does that mean? More than one person began, perhaps, to reply. Our host, taking advantage of the abrupt silence which fell after several people had realized that they were all speaking at once, said, in a rather amusing voice, It is certainly rather curious, indeed coincidental, but just this morning I was in the library looking through some old volumes, especially a set of Dickens, which I suppose my grandfather had bound, as it had his rubrico embossed on the covers, when I found a sort of scrapbook which had been maintained on this subject. Here is Rui with the chocolate for which his wife is famous, and I shall ask him to bring the scrapbook while we are sipping some of it. The chocolate well deserved that she should be famous. It was excellent. Lena had made it. Her name was Lena. It was miraculous. And while Alberta Morris, her maiden and pen name, was drinking it, her eyes seemed to grow larger and larger. She gave a perceptible smack as she took the cup away from her mouth, and then said, "El Vilvoy, but what does that mean?" From La Voz de la Nación, with Section in Inglés. What a storm of outrage swept through the streets and houses of our Ciudad Uruguay when one heard yesterday night that affront had been offered to our well-known and well-beloved Miss Brita O'Hara by a bruto, whose name will shortly be discovered by our conscientious police, who all night sourced the meaner streets and alleyways which do no honor to us. The dear Miss Verta, the granddaughter of Capitan Montserrat, our great patriotic hero, had been delayed on some errand of mercy to an humble casa near the port section of town, when coming out en route to the awaiting carriage of her papa, the English Colonel O'Hara. The idiom Inglés does not contain the letter R, hence Colonel equals Colonel and Londres equals London. How curious. When, from the penumbrous area of some copse of trees, there emerged that criminal tipico with pistole in hand, who seized this innocent miss roughly by one arm and exclaimed, "I will have at least your money, and perhaps more." In the opinion of some people, in fact, of lots, a little of such style goes a long way, a very long way. And yet, someone many years ago told me, as regards more accurate translations of the Bible, that he would rather "arise, O Lord," than "get up, God." And although we are dealing here with an entirely secular text, yet there is something in the flavor of the basic form of it which appeals to me more than a smoother version might. Readers who disagree will still, I hope, excuse me if some more of the original from time to time seeps through. Avanti. Leaving to one side his discursions about the importance to the national economy of the Colonel O'Hara's factory where Uruguayan cattle were processed into an essence of beef, much advertised in the United Kingdom, and reminders of the late and great Capitan Montserrat's famous charge up the slope of Castel Uruguay to bring the royal Spanish flag tumbling down, our reporter, Senor Cruz, at length describes the young girl's piteous cries for help, the shameful cowardice of some unnamed city men who were nearby but evidently afraid of the pistole, and finally plunges into the matter of our story, videlicet that there then stepped forward with impetuous gait a most remarkable young man, in almost ragged garments, in antique cut of rawhide, and upon his feet curious footwear, devised also from the uncured skin of an animal, such as one has not observed in years, but only in the illustrations of some old leyendas. Upon his head also a hat of shaggy leather. This young man of such startling appearance, when he heard the cry of fear and pain from the defenseless girl, Missy Everetta, uttered a savage shout and leaped forward, swinging his bush knife or machete. Quickly he slashed in such a way as to draw the scoundrel's blood, who, the scoundrel, was immediately lost to sight as he fled, the coward, into the enveloping darkness. It appears he made his way, the monster, to the night clinic of the medical hospital, where he attempted to have reattached the severed ear, which he had brought with him untidily wrapped in a bag. But the advanced medical student on duty insisted that a chirurgeon would have to be summoned, whereat the wretch fled yet again into the night, and one hears that he is attempting to depart our country by the back trails. But the frontier guards have been alerted by telegraph, and he must soon be catched, the fiend. Unless, of course, he may find refuge amongst the teeming criminals which also protect the profugitives in the adjacent republic, so-called, of Babadia y las Bonitas, El B&B, as we crisply put it. Falsely does that other country claim the Las Islas Encantadas, for which we are ready to shed our blood. Further, La Voz de la Nación had gathered the following information. The young man whose manners and appearance reminds one of the works of one Jacques Rousseau or the novel Paul y Virginia, not to mention the archetipo classico Robinson Crusoe, is Antonio, the son of the pioneer settlers Cielor, Swiss or perhaps Baltico in origin. The Patriarcho Cielor's son resides with his parents and some infant brothers in the island Encantara Grande, when he has come with his father to the mainland of our republic to purchase what few supplies their humble and hard-working efforts have enabled them to afford. The Europeans, Senor and Senora Cielor, have for several years inhabited all by themselves and young children this rugged island, part of that archipelago. See how they naturally regard their capital city as Ciudad Eregue and not of some other nacion, as it speciously proclaims. And there they have lived alone for most of 1 year to another, it being unusual to have even a visit from a fisherman's boat because of distance and the savage seas. Having been thus raised practically alone in a wildness, he has grown up, as one says, a wild boy, wearing no clothes, not a production of that wildness, and never was sick a day in his life, as he declares in his simple, wholesome, and naif way. Although void of any artifice and entirely sans sophistication, exactly as one has read about in books by European savants. But consider the bravery of this doubtless wild boy who has never been 1 day in school, how he rushed forward, careless of his own life, a true cavalier of the wilderness. He well deserves to be considered a noble son and citizen of this republic, the justly named wild boy without a thought of fear, so similar to the bravo Capitan Montserrat, our national hero, whose granddaughter... Here the clipping ends. Thus, the report was written by Gustavo Gomez Cruz, who, for many years, wrote the English-language column Amigos, Friends, for the daily La Voz de la Nación, of which allegedly his brother-in-law was sole proprietor. But what difference does it make? As for this mention of Antonio Cielor, it seems certain that mostly it was true. Thus, the legend of the wild boy of the islands sprang almost full-grown, in an instant, or anyway, in a night. A few comments now to those skeptical persons who are everywhere. It is said that the boy certainly did not wear a goatskin hat in the manner of Crusoe, but that the hat band may have been goatskin. It is said that his clothes were certainly not all made of rawhide, though parts of them may have been. And certainly his shoes or sandals or boots, whatever you may call them, moccasins, had been made by the elder Cielor himself. And why not? Furthermore, in regard to the incident at the night door of the hospital, there has been some skeptical insistence that the man who had appeared there for medical or surgical attention to his ear had certainly not carried it with him in a rag, despite the firmness of the legend on this detail, but that it had been severely bitten in a cantina brawl and bore no mark of a slash with a sharp weapon such as a machete. As for the legend, it adjusted itself on this point. The wild boy had both slashed the thug with his machete and then bitten off his ear, which the thug then wrapped in a rag and carried with him to the infirmary. A newspaper drawing not long after showed a figure looming out of darkness and carrying in one hand a pistol and in the other an object, out of which blood dripped along the ground. It was very vivid, indeed, the stuff of legend. As for the subsequent history of this man, or if there were indeed either men, there is no subsequent history. Fables of an earless man howling for revenge in the moonlight are simply fables. The darkness had swallowed him or them, and the darkness continued to, as it were, keep him, them, swallowed, which, since we are in the presence of legend, is perhaps as it should be. And in regard to the young man's given name, really it was not Antonio, an understandable mistake. Evidently, his full name was William Washington Cielor. This not having been fixed into law by the Medes and the Persians, he was sometimes called Bill, sometimes Billy, and sometimes often Tony. And the elder Keylors were, very simply, from the Isle of Man. Perhaps this is not as simple as it sounds. It may be that Senor Gomez Cruz really did think that Man was a canton in Switzerland or an island in the Baltic Sea. There, after all, are islands in the Baltic Sea, aren't there? Or it might be that the word Manxman was a bit beyond him. At any rate, the elder Keylors had had some earlier experiences with island life. Why didn't they, if tired of, say, life in London, simply go back to the Isle of Man? Perhaps because it was full of English tourists, all hoping to hear one of the 11 or 15 people who could still speak Manx. And as for that simply despicable person sitting over there in the corner and muttering that the old Manx form of the name was Ilium, cognate Gaelic Liam, without an additional W, why, let him go back where he came from. Senor Murphy, having paused at this point to wet his whistle, like with a sip of chocolate, Senora Murphy turned to the farmer, fellow. "Your family, they're all well, I trust?" The young man answered simply, "Yes." After a moment she said, "My aunt will appear presently." I had somehow a faint impression that she had forgotten or simply did not know his name. But she had evidently touched the right note, because he then said, "Ah." Not one of your very talkative types, evidently. Afraid he might scare away the game, or make the off-ox turn left instead of right. Ivan Sanderson once said that people speak of the silence of the jungle when really they're very noisy places. Or did Ivan Sanderson just say the opposite? I met him once or twice. Very nice man. But he's gone now. But as to the matter of William or of Bill, that is nothing compared to the words, phrase, perhaps, title, perhaps, set down crisply enough by Gomez Cruz at least twice, if not consistently, as Wild Boy. Although one stands, shall we say, surprised at his statement that English contains no R, it certainly seems that Spanish does not make abundant use of W. Let us, however, not forget the W equals double U, that U and V are variant forms of the same letter, and that there are a number of languages, including Spanish, in which V and B are not what one would call clearly distinct. Consider Servia and Serbia, Habana and Havana, Sevastopol and Sebastopol, and for that matter, Avram and Abram. The second given name of old Keylor's oldest son was to cause the journalists and typesetters of Ciudad Uruguay enormous difficulties. Sometimes it appeared as Washington, sometimes as Boshinden, or even Washington, or sometimes Washington. Old Keylor was much impressed by immense liberator figures. But mostly, young Keylor was referred to in the press as the Wild Boy. Two English words, also not without their transliterational difficulties, and which went through sundry forms as El Wild Boy, Wild Voy, Valdoy, or finally, and eternally, Vilvoy. A headline from some time later, Bienvenida, Vilvoy. Further transmutations and confusions, such as Bill Boy, Billy Boy, and Bell Boy, we will leave as well enough alone. Vilvoy. There. The Uruguayans knew a good loanable word when they saw one. It just took them a while to pin it down and stabilize it. And have we, in the English idiom, done a sight better with Montezuma, or whatever, and for that matter, batata? No, indeed. Well, that more or less completes our survey of what we might call El Vilvoy, Part 1. Onward. It was the practice for many years of Colonel O'Hara, in his capacity as honorary British vice-consul, to call formally once a year at the presidential palace and deliver a note reminding the Republic of the British claim to Las Islas Encantadas. HM government what with the Maori and Mahdi and other such vexatious people having other matters than that small southern Atlantic archipelago on the front of their desks. What? Its desks? Nonsense. Her Majesty's government are, no more to be said, claim to Las Islas Encantadas, or, as my lords preferred to call them, Lord Iggin's Islands, after the delivery of which the president would give him a glass of sherry and a cigar. Both, we understand, very good. And then they would enjoy a half-hour's pleasant conversation of the subject of, as it might be, horseflesh. That is to say, not hippophagy, but breeding. French reminders of the French claim were more sporadic. Echo in Cada dia of Ciudad Bobadilla. Napoleon III has escaped from England and is destined to arrive in the Islas Encantadas. Nap 3 never made the scene, alas. But the claims of the adjacent republic, adjacent to Uruguay, that is not to France, of Bobadilla y las Bonitas, were something else. True that both republics were agreed that Spanish sovereignty of the islands after the overthrow of Spanish colonial rule had passed. Aye, there's the rub. Passed to whom? Or to which? Opinions differed. They very much differed, and continued to differ. 9 days' wonders we always have with us, and perhaps interesting news was a bit scarce at that time. At any rate, the newspapers in Ciudad Uruguay certainly made very much of the Vilvoy. And so did opinion in the not inconsiderable portion of the public which did not read newspapers. Tributes to his modesty and, if not to his piety, old Kielor, one of the single occasion when he was solicited upon theology, declared himself to be a believer in an universal force, or influence, in nada más. Then, anyway, to his filial piety. Headline in La Prensa Nacional: Vilvoy thinks only of his papa. We who described yesterday the collection of a purse to reward the Vilvoy for his courage are now proud to disclose that, when asked what gift he desired, the Vilvoy replied, only a pouch of good English tobacco for his papa. It seems that the father of Kielor grows naturally his own tobacco on those islands, which pertain to our country. But this year the crop was not all what was hoped for. Colonel O'Hara, father of the augustly descended, sweet and becomingly timid girl whose life the Vilvoy saved, immediately ordered, purchased, and placed on board the fishing vessel by which father and son will return to their chosen island of settlement an entire case of the best English pipe tobacco available from the enterprising merchants here. El Vilvoy professed himself delighted. The Prensa has learned that the Coronel has offered either or both of the Kielors good employment at the factory which produces the beef essence that the English use as tea, but that they both declared that nothing will make them surrender their residencia and small farm, which, with such hard labor, they have ached and hewn, as one might say, from the wilderness. We are also precisely informed by the Ministry of National Lands that a writ of title to the aforesaid terrain will be most immediately issued to the Señor Kielor. Señora K. had remained in the islands with her younger children. When asked if he were not afraid of her safety, the father Kielo declared that no one who lives under the flag of the Republic of Uruguay need fear any man. Also, he reminds us that in a true state of the natura, one lives in harmony with nature's laws, and then remains always without the well-founded fears to which the urban dweller is a prey. Both he and his son, El Vilvoy, wear their hair much long, except that the latter, of course, has almost no beard upon his manly young face. Observe, please, readers, the likeness of his fearless and untainted countenance in this press via means of the latest photographic process. Thus it is possible, precisely, to date the first known photograph of El Vilvoy. And in fact, this photograph was reproduced and sold widely for quite a while through the Ciudad and in 1 or 2 provincial towns, both in black and white and in sepia. Father and son, and a cargo of more supplies than either had hoped for. Old Kielor would not accept money, which he in fact called by many harsh names, but he agreed to accept agricultural tools, seeds, and nursery stock, fishing lines and hooks, gunpowder, lead, cartridges, and a nice new shotgun. returned presently to their far distant island home. Quite a throng saw them off at the mole, and the Ministry of Corrections and Justice quietly put away its plans to locate a penal colony somewhere in the islands. When the newspapers said, as say they did, that the president of Uruguay, Eduardo Gaspar de la Vara, DDS, had promised that he would visit the pioneering family when he could manage to find the time to escape from the cares of state, they said but the truth. Dr. de la Vara was then in his 42nd year. He had attained to office entirely by constitutional means, and he was determined to leave office in the same manner. His physician, Dr. Cipriano Madriago, said to him one day after the routine examination, "Previous holders of your august office have been either soldiers or attorneys. You are unique in having a scientific degree. Therefore, may I speak with you not as a citizen to the president, but as one scientist to another?" "Securely you may," said el Doctor Don Eduardo. "Proceed." "If I were to work too hard," said Madariago, "my assistant could always assume my duties, for a limited period of time, of course." "Of course." "Only the layperson scarcely appreciates that the corpus and the spiritus are entirely intertwined. Do you agree?" "Agreement is most absolute." "We say of a garment made of good sound cloth that it wears like iron, do we not? And yet iron may eventually wear out, so—" Here the president interrupted. He was a small man, but he was courageous. "Are you about to tell me, Sir Medicine Doctora, that I am about to wear out?" The physician crossed himself 3 times. "I beg you, my friend, do not jump to conclusions. Any man who works hard may require a rest in order to recuperate his powers. But if, unlike, say, me, you should require a rest, is there someone who could assume your duties until—" Perhaps Gaspar de la Vara rapidly considered the political state of affairs in Uruguay. "Sir Medical Doctor, you have reason," he exclaimed. "No, there is not, save, perhaps, for the very shortest period of time." Dr. Madariaga nodded. "How short a period of time? Could you not take a rest for, say, 2 weeks? Only 2 weeks. As your friend, I implore you. As your physician, I order you." Gaspar de la Vara came to a, perhaps, rapid decision. "And what sort of a rest?" he inquired. "For 2 weeks, not more." "Alas," said the physician, "we have here not healing springs, spas, they are called in Europe. How they invigorate, how they juvenicate, but facts are facts, and in the absence of any such in our own country, and as it is impossible to go to Europe right now, I have no hesitation to recommend—" He hesitated. "A short sea voyage," he concluded, and watched the other's face. Immediately the president exclaimed, "I shall make a cruise of our overseas territories." "You will sail around the Enchanted Islands in the national yacht?" "No, I shall go via the steam vessel, and I shall keep well in the mind the maritime wisdom of the liberator." His friend, the medical doctor, slapped him on the back, and they embraced. From a contemporary statement in La Voz, "The President will make a voyage of inspection beyond the seas in keeping with the famous maritime maxim of the Liberator. Did not the Liberator himself declare that whoso controls the sea controls the coast, and whoso controls the coast controls the interior? Therefore, whoso controls the sea, paradoxically as it may seem, he controls the interior? Indeed, it is not necessary to explicate the reference to the liberator Ignacio Gomez de la Cedilla, often called the San Martin or the Bolivar of central coastal South America, east, of whom the whole world has heard, almost. In fact, the Republic of Uruguay was the current owner of the locomotive vessel La Victoria, formerly Her Britannic Majesty's steam ram Cinque, and this at a time when the adjacent Republic of Bobadilla y Las Bonitas had only recently recognized that the gallery was obsolete, and the adjacent Republic of Nueva Andorra had acquired the former Confederate privateer Arkansas. It had been engaged, in the interim, in the corned mutton trade out of Port Bangalong, Eastern Australia. This exemplum of the fleet in being had struck terror into the hearts of all would-be invaders of the Araguayan littoral. Not even do we exempt Brazil. Commanding the Victoria was the Capitán de Costa, and also present was the learned and unpredictable Dr. Hector McVitie. Capitán de Costa made up for his Brazilian birth by voicing objections whenever the emperor's name was mentioned. Tawdry fellow, he called him, a Freemason, a Yankee lover, a friend of the Negroes and the Imperialista. The Capitán de Costa had visited the not-often-visited islands, and so knew, anyway, something about them, besides the fact that they were there. That was something. It was often reported and often denied that Nueva Andorra had once sent La Desiderata, formerly the Arkansas, under a politically appointed and inexperienced commander on a voyage to Brazil. Asked upon his return, how were things in Brazil, he had replied with a shrug, "Brazil isn't there." Dr. McVitie did not engage in much conversations, but all the while he made sketches, of the sort for which he was almost famous. And it is indeed from these sketches and from letters to his brother Sawney, the Reverend Alexander McVitie, that a number of the details of this voyage have been supplied. The letters and sketches mostly repose in the Lord Marechal's Library and Museum in Edinburgh, to the learned curators of which we express our thanks. Their charges have been, considering inflation and rates of exchange, almost modest. Nevertheless, we will not bore readers, at any rate I hope I am not boring mine, with many details, though the South Atlantic seas can be very rough indeed. One reason, no doubt, why the Islas had been so seldom visited, the voyage of La Victoria was fairly untroubled. She anchored in the windward of Encantada Grana, and several times a day people put ashore in her small boat, or launch. And of course, the shore visits of the passengers were more frequent than those of most of the crew, who, truth to tell, were not much inclined to land on these isles containing none of the amenities which sailors prefer to encounter whilst ashore. And a very wild and rocky shore it was, too, though little did this seem to disarrange the famous great tortoises. "See these great tortoises, Your Excellency." "Never mind such titles, Capitan. Call me simply Doctor. But where are they all going, so very, very slowly? Either to crunch the flesh of the prickly pear cactus between their horny jaws, or in search of these hidden springs which they alone mostly know about." Consider then, at this time, the President of the Republic, no silk hat, no frock coat, no sash of office, no, clad in simple costume borrowed from the third mate, and with the same well-worn sombrero de hipiapa which he wore, almost one wishes to say wears, so strong is habit, at home, how eagerly he traverses the rocky landscapes of the largest of the islands, which never before had been trotted by presidential foot. Observe the slight flush of pleasure and the quick degree of impatience. He brushes aside all offers of helping hands, and soon, with only a single guard to accompany him, he vanishes into the brush, or bush, or however one wishes to describe it. Those trees of which the sound of an axe has seldom menaced. The dense thicketry, the "Come, follow me!" exclaims the Capitán de Costa, in a tone of command which never he would have used to the President himself. "I know of a shortcut. We will soon encounter them." Everybody obeys. Sure enough, a trail is found. All follow it. Birds call out. The small animalitos or insectivos also appear. What glorious, and one may accurately say, gorgeous butterflies. But what care, momentarily, the visitors, save for the taciturn Dr. McVitie, who, almost as he moves, he sketches. Behold, the party has reached at last the small plantation which the pioneer settler family, whose profugitives from the scurrying and unhealthy throngs of European city dwellers, has cleared with great labor from the bosque. There is the family Kielor, almost as though they had gathered for the purpose of welcoming the President. The father Kielor greets his civic leader with a warm handshake and an embrace. Mother Kielor leaves for a moment the homemade frame on which she embroiders, so to speak, textiles made from the wild flax with threads spun from a local fiber and dyed with local dye stuff, representations of the autochthonous flora and fauna, and waves her hand at the great chief magistrate. Several small boys of various sizes at first stand off shyly, then slowly creep forward and are greeted with paternal pats upon their heads. Delicious odor fills the air. To be specific, a lunch was cooking of goat flesh, several sorts of names and patatas, as well as the famous wild spinaches, so good against the dreaded scurvy. After some few minutes, the president says, "But I do not see here your oldest son, whom always we fondly remember by the name of El Vilvoy. Forever will we remember with what bravery he bit off the ear of that savage fellow, a foreigner, I need not say, whilst defending the Miss O'Hara, la Bertita Chica. Where is he?" Scarcely has the above account, transposed from the holographic, seems rather confused. On the one hand, the president has vanished into the woods with one single naval guardsman, and yet here he is described as being already present at the Kielor house and farm, with no explanation or transition. Well, we must take history as we find it. And as the almost fabulous Captain Sir Juan Schmidt so aptly puts it, history without geography is a wandering carcass. Or perhaps it is the other way around. The Capitan Sir Juan Esmis, rescuer of Las Pocahontas, was not a literary man. Scarcely has the initial burst of enthusiasm subsided sufficiently for the babble of voices to terminate for a moment, when distinctly are heard some distant shots, securely of firearms. Exclaims the elder Kielor, "That is not my son. He took with him this morning only a machete when he left to examine some traps and snares. Let us go at once in that direction." And directly he trots off in another direction. Navy officers cry commands to their few men, and they begin to run in a more direct direction. But the Dr. McVitie calls out to warn them of the dangers of the hedge of prickly pears which they are about to charge through, of their large thorns which draw blood, and, much more dangerous, their tiny and usually at first glance unseen spines, those which break off in the flesh and fester, causing more infection and sores of great pain, often indeed leaving scars. In a moment prevail the heads more cooler. It is realized the Patriarcho Kielor doubtless knows best the paths of his own land. If he runs off in a certain direction, doubtless it is to find a passable lane through the wilderness, which will presently change its direction according to the contours of nature. It is not to be thought that these considerations are the results of subsequent meditations. And the reader already knows that the shots had been fired by certain troops of the counter-claimant nation for the sovereignty of Las Islas. In other words, not to cavil at the truth, the Republic of Bobadilla and Las Bonitas, as it is commonly and simply called, El B&B, only in the Vulgate. When the intelligent semaphore on the well-sited Goat's Head Hill, overlooking La Ciudad de Eregüe and the circumjacent waters, had signaled with both its arms out straight that, in other words, a side-wheel steamer was approaching, the black ball hoisted at the same moment, indicating that it was one of our naval vessels, and next went up the presidential flag. At once a crowd began to gather at the mole, for it was realized that this meant the return of the steam ram La Victoria, with the president on board. Meanwhile, of course, as the semaphore continued working, while the ship drew nearer, and both were sending and transcribing messages to each other, but little heeded this the throng, most of whom naturally could not read the semaphore letters, nor had they telescopes to see what the ship was saying. But those who had the knowledge and the means, including, of course, several people of the Department of Naval Affairs, as well, naturally, one need hardly say, the journalists, they were transfixed, electrified by what these messages implied. And as word of this spread so rapidly through the city, of course, the crowd grew vast. The questions at the interview. Question. Mr. Dr. President, is it indeed true that you had been, as it were, lost in the jungle on Encantara Grande, and that the Vilvoy himself then rescued you? Answer. With the frankness which characterizes my nature, I answer simply, almost I might have become alarmed, but the Vilvoy heard my calls, and fairly at once he rescued me. Question. Ah, thank God! You seem to be in entire good health. In fact, one might say, in better. Is it not true? Answer. Yes. Question. And is it also true that this is because the Vilvoy led you to some medicinal springs of the sort called spa? Answer. Perceiving that I was very hot and somewhat fatigued, he did indeed lead me to some springs in an obscure place in which certainly I bathed. As to its medical qualities, Dr. McVitie regrets that I did not carry away with me a sample of the spring water, but I had no thought of that, as for my health it may be that the exercise and the sea breezes had something to do with it. But there are more important matters, and if you will excuse me, I observe that my carriage is over there, and... Question. Ah, but, Sir Dr. President, what of these important matters? Is it true that some troops of the counter-claimant country, I refer to El Bey, had landed and were attempting an invasion, the shameless ones? Answer. Yes. At this, roars of indignation swept the crowd, and, almost immediately, the city. The survivors of the invasion had been observed making an escape in a small boat, from which, it is adjudicated, they transferred into a larger one. Nothing more than the coal supplies of our steam vessel were limited for a return to port only, prevented the Capitan de Costa from at once pursuing this estimated other vessel. But our nation was well satisfied that the villains had suffered a sufficient punishment in that fearlessly El Vilvoy had attacked with his machete and, it cannot be doubted, cut off 6 of their heads. Effectively, how they could have resisted with their superior firepower, as it is called, save only his already perceived famous wild bravery struck terror to their hearts, the cowards, and they fled. As to the flag which they had previously succeeded to plant on the volcanic soil of Las Islas, one may behold it any day at the Museum of the National Patrimony, hours from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. A very small surcharge is necessarily made for the benefits of widows and orphans. But the public may donate the dueños such gratuities they wish. What greater evidences of breach of faith is needed to condemn a neighboring nation with whom we were legally at peace for invading our quasi-paternal soils? Well could we, of the Republic of Uruguay, have stricken back and given then, as one says, tit for tat, save that the generous heart of our then Presidente Dr. Gaspar de Levara was moved to avoid any breach between 2 adjacent nations of this continent, and so, after a period marked by recriminations on their part and of cold silence on our own, imagine they accused us of fabrication of the account of the heads. The matter has passed off and no longer spoils the cordial relations which now obtain between our 2 countries, brothers as we are in blood and language anyway. But think of this mere youth, how he fearlessly struck off the heads of 16 necessarily much larger grown men. What an ensample for our young people to admire. Ah, how very well founded is this legend of El Vilvoy de las Islas. At this point, or perhaps at some other nearly contemporary point, the counter-claimant nation simply turned its back on the whole thing. Headline in the Cada Dia newspaper, widely recognized as government organ, declares the King of Sweden and Norway, the nations of Europe are very contented to recognize that the confederational union of Bobadilla and Las Bonitas is indissoluble. The king of Sweden and Norway, that civilized and civil man, was always willing to issue such declarations whenever his ministers asked him, and much it helped the union of Sweden and Norway. Its effects on South American sales of canned sardines and wooden matches cannot be precisely calculated. So far as is known, only once did El Vilvoy travel into the interior of Uruguay. At least, only once, which is known. It is realized that the generosity of the vaqueros was almost an embarrassment, they incessantly surrounding and offering him many copas of rumdinga, their famous knave but strong drink. Also constantly they surrounded his horse, and soon all of its tail's hairs had been plucked out for souvenirs and alleged cures for the infirmities of the male person. In these matters of folk wisdom, who indeed can say? And as it was seemingly impossible, if not indeed difficult, to avoid almost similar scenes in the Ciudad, if thereafter for sundry times of sundry years he came to the capital and port, it would have been as incognito, slipping in and out and then away again. His arrival, departure, presence, alleged comments, and appearances, almost in the popular mind and perhaps higher in some essential details, resembles the doctrine of Sebastianism, as within the memories of some old and still living people one found it yet in Brazil, let alone in the question of it in Portugal. But of course, the mysticism or not, in essential detail, this difference, El Vilvoy was not dead. But the skeptics. The skeptics, oh! Of much would the skeptics have liked to dismiss entirely the matter of the 26 severed heads as lies, old crones' tales, and propaganda. But little have they been able. There is, for one thing, the testimony of President Dr. Eduardo Gaspar de Lavara, and, if revisionist historians would dismiss that, there was, for another thing, the testimony of the Dr. McVitie. Was not the Dr. McVitie the author of a learned monograph on certain disorders of the metatarsals, printed in the Journal of the National Scottish Medical Association? Little recked the ravings of the Cada Dia newspaper of the Ciudad de Bobadilla against the inflexible probity of the Journal of the National Scottish Medical Association. Alleged activities of the Dr. Alejandro Ncox and the uneducated Herr Burke are entirely beside the point. It is, of course, unfortunate that Dr. McVitie's renewed testimony was not available at a later date, but he had returned to his native land, there to engage upon his lifelong crusade to test and maintain the wholesome nature of Scotch whiskey as compared to brandy, and died in Peebles under muffled circumstances. And there is furthermore the irrefutable testimony of the sketches. The sketches, 4 in number, clearly show, each one clearly 6 of the severed heads reposing on their ledge or ledges in the secret cave. And how respectful were all the parties involved to refuse to disturb their repose or even to disclose their location merely to satisfy a rude curiosity, or for any other reason. As for the claim that the 4 sketches show the same 6 heads from slightly different angles, or that 4 times 6 equals 24 and not 26, this is a mere quibble. And also remains unidentified the alleged medical spring. It is secure that, so far as goes impartial evidence and testimony, El Vilvoy never acknowledged his heroism in this matter, merely giving a slight gesture and a grunt and a movement slightly of the mouth whenever asked of it. How this proves his essential modesty, that of the gentleman of nature, too educated even to deny what his interlocutor has inquired. Well, indeed, commented the Spanish priest, in a former time not yet so very far back at all, priests did not go about in casual dress ever, and with what dignity, too. But it now seems quite evident that those heads had probably nothing to do with the so-called invasion, the Las Bonitas incursion. Scientists tell us that probably they were the heads, if they existed at all, of pre-Columbian Indians, there on the islands, for mysterious and uncertain reasons. And it is true that the heads appear to be entire heads, unlike those prepared by the Jivaro Indians, rather on the principle of a stuffed olive, this priest conceded. Then he said, but modern science has determined that organic matter stored, so to speak, well within a cave at the well-known and naturally maintained cave temperature, cool but not freezing cold, may last forever in its original form. Witness, he said, the hide of the megatherium in Patagonia and the deposits of sloth dung in the cave in North America. The Vilvoy led the president and Dr. McVitie to the cave where the heads were. Well, perhaps he did, but that in no way proves that he had put the heads there, let alone removed them from the shoulders of the soldiers of Las Bonitas. The others there in the garden of La Villa de Murphy moved just a bit restively at this statement, but perhaps all were too polite to dispute or even to deny. The rural-looking young man said nothing. He seemed, if anything, politely a bit bored. Whiffs of memory, like faint scents of some aromatic plant growing not within sight, began to be perceived by me. Had he been, perhaps, the man with the gun and the game bag, who had nodded to us from the berm of the road near the forest as we slowed down to avoid a mud rut? I could not be sure. Or was he one of a couple of people considered a bogged-down piece of equipment in a field just before we stopped for water? Perhaps, sir, you will give us your opinion, suggested Licenciado Hubner politely. The young man seemed to consider the question for a second. Then he said, very calmly and equitably, no. And as though the attorney had asked her, to me, said La Doctora after a moment, the evidence upon the shell of the great Tortuga is a most remarkable thing. There was a murmur of agreement, and, seeing that I knew nothing of these things, 2 or 3 people recapitulated for me a conversation back there on Great Enchanted Island. Imagine, they directed me, imagine that black soil composed of volcanic origins, ground so very fine, and the black rocks scattered around, almost a terrain of the inferno. Here and there, going infinitesimally slowly, the giant tortoises, moving their flipper-like legs, and making so little distance with each step that one might walk alongside them as they did so. And in fact, walking exactly so is President E. Gaspar de la Vara, and so is Capitan da Costa. One points out to the other curious and atypical markings on the giant carapace of one huge crawler. Mira, Map, and Vipe? Are these not the initials of the explorer brothers Martin Alonso and Vicente Yanez Piñón? Indeed, what else? And examine this set carved on the other side. JPDL, Juan Ponce de Leon. Ah, that great pilot. Señores, we are in the presence of history. And of those there in the garden of the Villa, in that suburb of that southern South American city, several look directly at the young priest to see if he is not impressed. Why, he asks, should I doubt that they saw such initials? And why should I not doubt that they saw what had been put there by hoaxers, or shall we say, jokers? Giant tortoises may live long, but that long. On Santa Elena there is a great tortoise, said to have been there in the time of Bonaparte. Said. And on Tonga in the Pacific there is another one, said to have been brought there by Capitan Cook. Said. Humanity continues to divert itself with fables, and meanwhile it continues largely to refuse to accept the truth. Therefore, we all suffer. He said this with a certain intensity, low-keyed but emphatic, said the attorney dressed in that meticulous black and white. But, Father Juan, it does not follow, does it, that because we believe that certain tortoises may live to be old, very, very old, surely it does not follow that we deny the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church? And the young priest answered slowly, almost, I would say, reluctantly, that no, it did not follow. But although El Vilvoy made no further, as it were, public appearances in the capital and port, he continued to be seen from time to time by visitors from there to his almost native island. After all, he had been very young and small when his parents made their landing. From time to time, parties of such visitors, it depended always upon the weather, at least, and sometimes also upon other conditions, in time of prosperity, perhaps a bit more often, in times of civil unrest, certainly somewhat less often, parties of visitors would make what one might call a cruise. One might call it an excursion. Few indeed made the trip, which had to be made by foot, all the way from the shore to the farm. For one thing, it was not easy. For another, it was known that the Señor Cielors did not favor such visitations, interruptive of their private schedules and their private peace. Also, they said that visitors brought colds. It became the custom for one of the landing parties to fire 3 shots when they had landed. And eventually, usually while they were eating their picnic lunches, silently out of the wilderness there would appear upon the upper edges of the shore El Vilvoy. What exclamations, what risings to the feet, what one might say clamors, cheers, and always, or anyway, usually, or at any rate, often, someone would level a camera. "Ah, Tonio," the skipper would say casually. Imagine speaking casually to someone so remarkable. "Tonio, here are the things ordered by your papa. Here, you fellow, pile them well back from the tide line." And so on. Sometimes, as the visitors were returning to whichever small ship by rowboat or by motor launch, sometimes they looked back. El Vilvoy raised a hand in farewell, abruptly let it fall. What a waving of handkerchiefs! What cries of "Luego, Vilvoy," etc. But when they looked back again, always he was gone. Full page spread in La Voz. Headline: El Vilvoy, does his natural life keep him youthful? Is it his total revulsion of the semi-artificial foods of the civilized living which maintains the Vilvoy in his youthfulness? Is it the conditions so devoid of stress or pressure, in complete harmony with the rhythms of the tides and the cycles of the nature, which is preventing him from showing the signs of inevitable decay? Has his metabolism thus been slowed? Is he indeed, so to speak, un Peter Pan? Let us regard these incontestable photographical evidences. And there they were, each captioned with the names of the photographer and the date of the photograph, an entire series of pictures of El Vilvoy, over a period of, I forget how many years. Numbers do not settle well in my mind. Sometimes his hair was a little shorter, and sometimes a little longer. Sometimes he was wearing such and such a garment, sometimes another, but always, not usually, but always, really, the same face. And it did not really seem that he was any older in the last one than in the first one. "I believe it is the fruitarian diet," said La Doctora, emphasizing that this was her opinion with slow, deep nods of her handsome head. "I have known really remarkable results to occur from the fruitarian diet. I would observe it myself, but my family will not allow." But the other Senora Alvarado, was of a different opinion. "It is because he knows of a certain yerba which grows in a hidden vale there on that island, or some say on another of those islands, and twice a year he goes there secretly, and he eats that secret yerba, and it purifies his blood. Once in January and once in June he purifies his blood with the substance of this secret yerba, and it is that which prevents him from aging." Mrs. Flux said, "How very selfish of him. I'm sure that we would all love to know the name of this herb. Why don't we?" said the Senora. "Because it is a secret one." She said this very mildly, conscious of no artifice herself, and she nodded 2 or 3 times, not very deeply, but somewhat less than rapidly. Clearly to her, that was all the explanation needed. Said the Spanish priest, "Old Padre Lizarraga of the Botanical Gardens." Everyone nodded at this reference. Afterwards I learned that it was not that they all knew Padre Lizarraga, but that they all knew the Botanical Gardens, or knew of the Botanical Gardens. Told me that he had spent 40 years investigating the native herbal medicaments, so often said to be as good for this ailment or for that, and the result of his studies was that he found that 95% of them were purgatives. I felt that he expected this statement would make some certain effect, but none was visible. Only the usual polite nods. After a moment, he went on. Surely we have all heard of the deception theory. And the attorney said, The malice of the press of Las Bonitas is almost beyond belief. Conceive with what effort this theory must have been compounded. So now I heard, if only in faintly greater detail, for the first time more about old Keilor's other sons than the sole fact of their existing. Old Keilor's sons had been named, one after the other, Washington, Bonaparte, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Masaryk, called informally Tony, Boney, Sony, Coney, and Max. Either history had ceased to supply old Keilor with immense liberator figures, or time had changed the angle of the telescope. Or else old Keilor had been simply consistent, and it was we who had underestimated Masaryk. And the deception theory was, simply, that the entire Keilor family, prompted, so it was implied, by the government of Uruguay, had conspired to deceive the visitors to Las Encantadas by replacing each brother, as he grew older, with the next youngest brother. That is, the tourists or trippers, the visitors, had only seen the real Tony for an unnamed period of time. After that, the one who came down to the shoreline and was photographed would have been Boney. And when his own inevitable maturity would have become obvious, the one who was introduced as El Vilvoy was actually Sony. And so on, down through Coney and Max. And here one heard certain other variations in the conventional legend. Boney would make a patriotic speech. Coney performed a certain dance, presumably of his own invention. Sony would hang from a branch of a tree by the shoreline and swing back and forth. Max brandished a machete and demanded assurance that the party was really from Uruguay and not Las Bonitas. Mostly, I had just looked and listened. Now I asked a question. Had anyone here ever been to Grand Encantada? But one does not go there anymore, said the senora whose husband was un bureaucrata, because it is uncomfortable the voyage, and on the island there is no retreat, and nowadays one has the cinema. The youthful stranger had rolled himself dexterously a cigarette, in what looked like a leaf of pale tobacco, and now he lit it and sat forward in his chair, watching the smoke. It was not rank, merely somewhat strange. I thought that perhaps it reminded me of the small puro being smoked by the man, his face I did not see, who had brought the side of venison to the restaurante where Diego and I had eaten the morning before our arrival in the Ciudad. Only, perhaps I did see his face. But when had these visitations left off? Opinion was divided. And how many years had separated the brothers Keilor one from the other? No one had any idea. There were, however, any number of ideas involving such reference points as the revolution of the year of drought, and the interim presidency of the very sad leap year, and the battle of Apostolo Santiago, events clearly as significant to those other members present as the Bonus March, or Pearl Harbor, was to me, but of which we, all of us in the northern continent, were but utterly ignorant. Every Latin American republic has its own Alamo, its own Gettysburg, and we've never heard of any one of them. Nearer to us than to Uruguay is a country once convulsed by a great civil war, during a period which we remember chiefly for the wearing of sleeve garters and funny female hats. It was, however, where I now tarried, absolutely a matter of national belief that on the Islas Encantadas lived El Vilvoy, who had come to the rescue of an innocent young girl, daughter of a national hero, who was once menaced by a thug. He immediately bit off the thug's ear, thus causing him to flee into the night with his bleeding ear in one hand. B. This same wild but inestimably praiseworthy young Vilvoy had upon a subsequent occasion rescued none other but the President of the Republic from a gang of invaders intent upon depriving Uruguay of the sovereignty of the islands, and C. had cut off the heads of 27 of them and hidden the heads in a cave, and D. Mrs. Flux said, "In a way, it rather reminds me of Arthur in the island of Avalon, or of Barbarossa in his cavern asleep with his beard still growing, and of course of poor young King Sebastian, who didn't really die in battle 500 years ago, was it? And will, of course, some day return. My, I do rather like it. The priest, Padre Juan, had taken up his cup of chocolate, and now he put it down again. "We've all heard," he said, "of something which was done in another country which should not have been done." And again he took his cup, and again he put it down. And it seemed that there was now a bit more interest displayed. Could it be that people had been just a bit restive at hearing their own legend put down, and were now pleased to be hearing of some other nation being blamed for what? "I refer," said the priest, "to the Julio Castellano forgeries." People were being definitely more interested. I was certainly even more interested, for I had never heard of the matter. "What was that?" I asked. Julio Castellano, it was explained to me, had been a well-known journalist in Nueva Andorra. Perhaps he was at least as well known for his candid camera as for his candid commentaries. And in the celebrated series of news articles he had supplied, I did not learn exactly how many photographs of a leading political figure in the company of a leading theatrical artiste who was not his lawful, or even unlawful, wife. To make the matter very short, if not indeed curt, the photographs were revealed, exposed, as we might say, as forgeries, hoaxes of a sort. That is, they had all been taken of the two people involved in entirely different pictures, and the clever scoundrel had somehow joined the two together. Indeed, there was no real evidence that they had ever been together at any time in any place. Sought by the law and by the outraged husband of the leading theatrical artiste, Julio Castellano had fled the country for another, and there he had shot himself. "What do you suggest then, Father?" the attorney asked. "That the photographs showing the Vilvoy were all hoaxes? In that way?" Padre Juan hesitated for a moment. "What proof do we have," he asked, "that all or most of those pictures had not been taken in the course of, say, 1 or 2 years, with fictitious dates subsequently ascribed to them? Or what proof do we have that the dates may have not been, let us say, confused?" asked La Doctora. "But what proof do we have that they were?" It was, he said, a deduction, a theory, not an accusation. The press was almost everywhere of a sensationalist tendency, ready to manufacture exciting news when that happened to be in short supply. It would not have been difficult to assemble a collection of photographs and to misascribe or even to confuse their dates. "Thus gratifying," he said, "the jaded tastes of public unnaturally eager for always more novelty, more and more novelty, even when it involves an interference in the natural law, whereby all men are mortal, and whereby all live and age must become aged." The attorney made a gesture which foretold a comment. Then, for a moment, he withheld his comment. Then he said, "I believe, Reverend Sir, that you wish to remind us that the Church cautions us against accepting a miraculous explanation for anything as long as a mundane explanation is acceptable." He did not put it in the form of a question. And the priest slowly nodded his agreement that this was, indeed, just what he meant. A murmur was heard, as that of several people all saying, at once. While the latter part of the conversation had been going on, I was aware of a figure walking very slowly around the other end of the gardens. It was a large garden and might very well have rightfully deserved the plural form, but this had not been in the forefront of my mind. Presently the figure came gradually nearer, and I saw that it was an old woman. Whoever said that in passing through life, or however does it go, be sure to pause and smell the roses, would have been pleased with this elderly person, stopping, stooping, bending her face to the blossoms. Almost she seemed to be stroking the plants. And perhaps she was. "What a shame you had not been here even a few years ago," the attorney said to me. "You would have been able to meet the former President Gaspar de la Vara, who was tragically killed whilst driving his motor car when he was 96. and the senora said, 97. Slowly the woman drew nearer. Then slowly she wandered on away. Eventually I formed the thought, and leaned over and asked my host, "Who is that?" And I gestured. It was a small gesture. He gave her only the slightest of glances, smiled, so it seemed, fondly, and then he said to me, "That is my great-aunt Bertha. She never goes out, and socially she sees almost no one." Scarcely had I engaged this answer to my question than another question formed. For the young, as I had thought, hunter, or farmer, perhaps, who had, save for occasionally touching his very slight mustache and smoking his cigarette, hardly moved, he had gotten up, and, walking through the lower part of the garden, had come face to face with the old woman. She looked up as he stood before her, and then, in a rush, she held out her hands, and she took them. "Oh, Tony," she cried. "Oh, Tony, you never grow old." Afterword to El Vilvoy de las Islas. This poignant tale of the miseries of old age was written when Davidson was in his mid-60s and confined to a wheelchair. His linguistic and narrative acrobatics give form and history to a character unique in fantasy literature. The Vilvoy's antecedents are complex. One can discern traces of Rousseau's Noble Savage, Melville's The Encantadas, sketches of life in the Galapagos, a clear nod to the Tarzan novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs, a satire of the Swiss Family Robinson, etc. What if Henry James wrote Tarzan with a wacky foreshadowing of magic realism, is how Don Webb described the story. Howard Waldrop has observed that El Vilvoy de las Islas is like a Tarzan archetype written by a Spanish surnamed magic realist. Davidson's stories were usually lots wider and deeper than they were long. Henry Wessels.